The first call came before dawn, when the wind outside sounded like gravel being hurled against metal siding. I was half asleep, staring at my phone, listening to a woman whisper because she didn't want to wake her kids. Her voice was shaking. She said no plows had come through. She said the road had already disappeared under ice and drifting snow. Cars couldn't move. Power was flickering. And the storm hadn't even peaked yet. That part didn't surprise me. What stopped my breath was where the call came from. Cedar Ridge Estates, a gated mountain subdivision that, just 2 days earlier, had sent me a cold, formal email saying my snow removal contract was terminated for cause. They claimed they'd replaced my crew with another company, a company I'd never heard of, a company that, as far as I could tell, no longer existed on paper or in reality. Meanwhile, my trucks were fueled, crews were awake, routes were planned down to the minute. I was ready, but I was legally locked out. As the blizzard rolled in and the gates stayed shut, the same HOA that mocked my so-called ugly industrial trucks was now trapped behind its own paperwork. And the storm was only getting worse. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Snow removal was never just a job to me. In Hollow Creek County, winter isn't something you admire through a window with a mug in your hand. Winter here shuts down roads, traps people in their homes, and turns small mistakes into emergencies fast. If you don't take it seriously, people get hurt. Sometimes worse. I run Graves Snow and Logistics, one of the only full-capacity plow operations in the county. We're not a side hustle with 2 pickup trucks and a salt spreader bolted on the back. We run heavy diesel rigs, dedicated plows, loaders, and support trucks. We plan routes days in advance. We track weather windows by the hour. When storms hit, we don't improvise. We execute. That mindset comes from before the business. I spent years in the military, where preparation was the difference between chaos and control. When I came home, I saw how fragile winter response really was in rural areas like ours. So I started small. I bought worn-out equipment no one else wanted, rebuilt engines myself, patched hydraulics in freezing barns, and slowly hired people I trusted. A lot of them were veterans too, people who understood long hours, cold fingers, and doing the job right even when nobody was watching. We didn't win contracts by playing politics. We won them by showing up. Hospitals, fire access roads, utility corridors, school routes, places where failure isn't an inconvenience, it's a headline. Over time, our name became shorthand for reliability. If Graves was on the list, people slept a little easier during storms. Cedar Ridge Estates was different from the start. It sat above town, tucked into the mountains like a postcard. Perfect houses, fresh asphalt, decorative stone signs at the gate. It was private, gated, and obsessed with image. They cared about symmetry, quiet hours, and how things looked on social media. Snow removal to them wasn't about access. It was about appearances. They didn't want tracks. They didn't want piles. They didn't want noise before sunrise. They wanted roads that looked untouched, like winter decorations instead of working surfaces. From day one, it felt like we were speaking different languages. That gap turned into friction the moment Marilyn Crow took over the board. She was polished, always dressed perfectly, always smiling, but never warm. The kind of person who spoke in calm tones while asserting control in every sentence. She didn't introduce herself to me as a partner in safety. She introduced herself like a manager evaluating a contractor she assumed she could replace. Our first meeting told me everything. She walked around one of my trucks, arms crossed, and said it looked too aggressive for the neighborhood. She asked if I could use something smaller, quieter, more refined. I explained patiently that smaller trucks don't clear deep drifts, and quiet equipment doesn't move ice off steep grades. I explained that their elevation and exposure made heavy gear necessary. She nodded, smiled, and clearly didn't care. Within weeks, complaints started rolling in. Emails about tire marks, messages about salt residue on decorative stone, accusations that my crew was damaging the aesthetic harmony of the community. Marilyn framed everything like a branding issue, not a safety one. I tried to meet her halfway. We adjusted timing to avoid early mornings when possible. We cleaned edges more carefully. We changed where we staged equipment so it wouldn't be visible from certain homes. None of it mattered. Every concession just led to another demand. The underlying issue wasn't the trucks. It was control. Marilyn didn't want a contractor who knew what he was doing. She wanted one she could dominate. Someone cheaper, quieter, and more obedient. Someone who would prioritize her authority over reality. The problem was, reality doesn't care about OA titles, and neither does winter. What was at stake went far beyond hurt feelings or a messy contract. My reputation mattered. One accusation from the wrong HOA could ripple through the county. My crew's livelihoods mattered. These were people with families who depended on winter work to get through the year. And most of all, the safety of residents mattered. Many of them never voted for Marilyn. Many of them trusted that someone competent was handling things. They had no idea how close they were to being left on their own. At the time, I didn't know how bad it was going to get either. I just knew something felt off. Too many complaints. Too much focus on image. Too little respect for the risks I kept documenting. Every email, every call, every adjustment request. Because when people stop talking about safety and start talking about control, you don't argue. You prepare. The escalation didn't come with yelling or threats. It came quietly, the way people who think they're clever always do it. The email landed in my inbox late in the afternoon. No phone call, no warning. Just a formal message written in stiff, corporate language, informing me that my snow removal contract with Cedar Ridge Estates was terminated for cause. The reasons were vague on purpose. Words like alignment, professionalism, and failure to meet evolving community standards. Nothing concrete. Nothing I could actually respond to. What stood out was the timing. Within hours of that email, residents received a second message from the HOA announcing that a new snow removal company would be taking over immediately. Marilyn framed it as a smooth transition, already handled, nothing to worry about. She even thanked residents for their patience, as if this had been planned for weeks. The company name jumped out at me the second I read it. I won't repeat it here, but I'd been in this county a long time. I knew every legitimate operator within 50 miles. This name didn't belong to any of them. That alone would have been suspicious, but something about it felt wrong in a deeper way. Too generic, too polished, like it was meant to sound official without actually being real. So I did what I always do when something feels off. I checked. Business registry first. Nothing active. Then licensing databases. No current snow removal permits. I widened the search and finally found it. The company had existed once, years earlier, but it had dissolved, shut down. No equipment, no crews, no insurance. On paper, it was a ghost. That's when I requested documentation from the HOA. I asked for the contract, proof of insurance, licensing, and emergency response plans. Standard stuff. Things any real operation would have ready to send without hesitation. What came back was worse than silence. The contract they sent was a mess. Wrong license numbers copied from unrelated businesses. Insurance policies that expired years earlier. Addresses that didn't match anything on record. And the signatures, those were the most telling. They were scanned, slightly skewed, and didn't match the publicly available examples tied to the name on the page. This wasn't incompetence. It was fabrication. Before I could even process that, Maryland made her real move. Overnight, Cedar Ridge installed a new motorized gate at the main entrance, a keypad, controlled system with fresh access codes that my crews did not have. I found out when one of my drivers called me from the road, staring at a locked barrier where he'd passed freely the day before. Emergency lanes, fire access, medical routes, all of it now controlled by a keypad the HOA alone managed. I stared at the photos he sent and felt my jaw tighten. This wasn't just about control anymore. This was about physically cutting off access during the opening hours of a major winter system. The forecast had already turned ugly. Temperatures dropping fast, wind picking up, snow accumulation expected to climb by the hour. In our county, that combination doesn't forgive mistakes. And yet there I was, legally locked out. The calls started soon after. At first they were confused. Residents asking when the plows were scheduled to arrive. Parents worried about getting out in the morning. Older folks asking if they should shovel their driveways now or wait. I answered every call the same way. Calm, professional, honest. I explained that my contract had been terminated by the HOA, that another company had supposedly taken over, and that I no longer had legal access to the roads inside the gates. Some of them didn't believe me at first. Others went quiet when it sank in. As the hours passed and the weather worsened, the tone changed. Voices tightened. Questions turned urgent. People told me no one had shown up. No salt, no plows, nothing. Inside, frustration built like pressure behind a wall. Every instinct I had told me to roll in anyway, to clear the roads, to help the people who were about to be trapped by someone else's arrogance. But instinct doesn't hold up in court. I knew exactly how this could be twisted if I acted without clearance. Trespass, interference, sabotage. Marilyn would claim she was right all along, that I was reckless, unprofessional, unstable. She would bury the fraud under a mess of accusations. So I did the hardest thing instead. I waited. And while I waited, I documented everything. Every call, every voicemail, every email, screenshots of the gate, timestamps on the weather updates, copies of the fake contract, metadata from the files they sent. I logged who contacted me and when. I saved social posts before they could be edited or deleted. I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I started building a record. Because when someone escalates from bad management to fabricated paperwork and lock gates, the situation stops being emotional. It becomes evidentiary. And I could feel deep down that this storm wasn't just going to expose the roads. It was going to expose Maryland too. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It crept in the way the worst ones always do. Quiet at first, almost polite, then suddenly everywhere. Snow started falling sideways, driven by wind that howled through tree lines and over ridges like it had a personal grudge. Temperatures dropped fast, the kind of cold that turns slush into concrete and mistakes into emergencies. Across Hollow Creek County, my trucks were already moving. We ran the routes we were legally responsible for. Hospital access roads first, fire lanes next, utility corridors after that. Engines roared through the dark, lights cutting white tunnels through the snow. Crews rotated in shifts, radios crackling, GPS logs updating in real time. It was exhausting, brutal work, and exactly what we were built for. One place stayed dark on my map, Cedar Ridge Estates. Not because I wanted it that way. Not out of spite, simply because policy is policy. Private roads, gated access, terminated contract, no clearance. No entry. While my crews were pulling stranded cars out of ditches elsewhere, Cedar Ridge sat untouched, its perfect roads slowly disappearing under layers of wind-packed snow. That's when Marilyn started panicking. Her messages shifted tone fast. The polite corporate language vanished, replaced by sharp, clipped accusations. She claimed I was refusing service out of retaliation. She hinted at legal action. She warned me not to interfere with the new contractor's operations. even though there was still no sign that contractor existed. Publicly, she played a different game. Posts appeared on the HOA page framing the situation as a temporary delay. She blamed weather intensity, claimed crews were en route, told residents to remain calm, to trust the process, to stop spreading misinformation. Inside the gates, reality was falling apart. I started getting calls that didn't sound confused anymore. They sounded scared. An older man told me his furnace had cut out and no repair truck could make it up the hill. A nurse said she couldn't get her car unstuck and had a shift she couldn't miss. Someone else whispered that an elderly neighbor hadn't answered their door since the night before. Cars slid sideways on untreated slopes and got wedged into snowbanks. Driveways vanished entirely, erased into smooth white drops that ended in nothing. Snow piled against doors. Wind drifted it back faster than anyone could shovel, and still no plows. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from someone I hadn't expected. Harold Bennett. He was a retired ski instructor who'd lived in Cedar Ridge since before the gates went up. Tough, practical, and not easily rattled. He didn't waste words. "You need to see this," he wrote. What he sent over changed everything. Screenshots of internal HOA emails. Board messages sent hours earlier, long before the public posts went up. Marilyn and the rest of the board scrambling, asking where the replacement company was, asking why calls weren't being returned, floating ideas about blaming weather delays, supply issues, anything that would buy them time. They knew no one was coming. And they were lying to residents anyway. That was the moment the puzzle locked into place for me. This wasn't a bad decision spiraling out of control. This was deliberate misrepresentation. Marilyn hadn't made a mistake and doubled down out of pride. She'd built the situation on falsehoods from the start. I went back to the contract with new eyes, not just reading it, but dissecting it. File metadata, creation dates, editing history. I compared signature samples more carefully this time, lining them up against archived records I pulled from public filings. That's when I saw it. The name on the signature, Richard Halley. I froze. I remembered the name because everyone in this business did. Richard Halley had run a small snow operation years back. He'd passed away after an accident. It had been talked about quietly, respectfully. His company dissolved soon after. I checked again, and again. There was no doubt. The signature on Cedar Ridge's replacement contract belonged to a man who had been dead for years. I sat back and felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger, not even shock. Clarity. This wasn't an HOA being difficult. This wasn't an authority dispute or a contract disagreement. This was fraud. Forged paperwork, a fake vendor locked gate, public lies. And now real people trapped inside a blizzard because someone wanted control more than accountability. At that point, my frustration burned off and left something colder behind: focus. Because when a situation crosses from incompetence into criminal behavior, the rules change. The way you respond changes. You stop thinking about how to fix the problem quickly and start thinking about how to fix it permanently. I backed everything up in multiple places, sent copies to my attorney, logged timestamps down to the minute, saved Harold's messages and every internal email he forwarded. Outside, the storm kept building, wind screaming through the valley, snow piling higher against doors and fences. Inside, I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer about snow, and Marilyn had no idea how exposed she'd just made herself. By the time I called Elaine Porter, the storm had already been raging for hours. Elaine wasn't just any attorney. She'd built her reputation going after municipal overreach and HOA abuse cases that other lawyers didn't want to touch. She understood how authority hides behind paperwork, and more importantly, how to strip that protection away. I didn't have to convince her this was serious. I sent her the contract first, then the metadata, Then the screenshots Harold forwarded. She went quiet for a long moment, reading, cross-checking, lining things up in her head. "This isn't messy," she finally said. "This is calculated. We built the timeline together, piece by piece. Every email from Marilyn and the board. The exact hour the gate was installed. The moment access codes were changed. The time stamps on the fake contract files. The public HOA posts claiming crews were on the way. The voicemails from residents saying no one had come. We laid it all out in order, so clean it almost felt surgical. Once everything was aligned, the picture was undeniable. The HOA didn't just remove me. They removed emergency access during a known storm window and replaced it with a vendor they knew could not perform. Then they lied about it. Elaine flagged something else I'd missed, an agenda notice for an emergency board vote, scheduled for that evening. The language was vague, but the intent was obvious. They were planning to backdate records, to adjust minutes, to create the illusion that approvals and vetting had happened earlier than they actually had. On paper, it would look like a procedural hiccup. In reality, it would be an attempted cover-up. Elaine didn't hesitate. "If they do that," she said, "they cross a line they can't uncross." That's when we made the decision to stop watching quietly. I didn't go to the meeting myself. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I asked my operations supervisor, Caleb Ross, to attend. Caleb had lived in Cedar Ridge for years before moving closer to town. He still knew people there. No one associated him with my company anymore. To the board, he was just another frustrated resident looking for answers. He went as a guest, sat in the back, said nothing, and he recorded everything. The meeting started the way these things always do. Marilyn spoke calmly, projecting confidence, thanking everyone for attending under challenging circumstances. She framed the situation as unfortunate but manageable. Weather complications, vendor delays, nothing anyone could have predicted. Then someone asked the wrong question. A resident wanted to know why the replacement company hadn't responded to calls. Another asked why there was no equipment visible anywhere near the neighborhood. The room shifted. Voices overlapped. Tension crept in. That's when Marilyn slipped. She didn't panic. She didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned forward and said they might need to clean things up internally. She talked about aligning records, about making sure the timeline made sense if anyone outside the community asked questions. She suggested adjusting meeting minutes so decisions appeared unanimous and properly sequenced. All of it was said casually, confidently, like someone who truly believed process could override reality. Caleb's recording caught every word. When Elaine listened to it later, she didn't smile. She didn't react at all at first. She just replayed one section twice, then paused it. "That," she said quietly, "is intent." Up until that point, the HOA could have claimed incompetence, poor judgment, even negligence. But recorded discussion of altering records during an emergency changed the category entirely. It showed awareness. It showed planning. It showed consciousness of wrongdoing. That recording turned a strong case into a devastating one. Elaine moved fast after that. She drafted injunction paperwork to stop any record alteration immediately. She prepared filings for emergency access interference. She alerted the county emergency office, attaching the evidence packet and emphasizing the locked gate, the fake contractor, and the risk to residents. She didn't make it dramatic. She made it undeniable. The plan from that point on was simple. We didn't confront Marilyn. We didn't threaten the board. We didn't warn anyone what was coming. We let them keep talking. Every message they sent, every post they edited, every minute they delayed real help while pretending everything was under control only added weight to the case. They thought time was on their side. Time was documenting them. Outside, the storm kept building, snow stacking higher against fences and doors. Inside the HOA, panic was setting in. They could feel control slipping, but they didn't yet understand why. Elaine told me something that night that stuck with me. People who abuse authority don't stop when they realize they're wrong, she said. They stop when their own actions make it impossible to continue. All we had to do now was let the HOA finish burying itself. And judging by how fast they were digging, it wasn't going to take long. By the time the blizzard peaked, the world outside had narrowed to sound and motion. Wind hammered the sides of buildings hard enough to make them shudder. Snow didn't fall anymore. It flew, horizontal and relentless, filling every cleared path as fast as it was opened. Visibility dropped to nothing. The kind of conditions where you don't ask if something will go wrong, only when. That's when the call came in. It wasn't a resident this time. It was a dispatcher, voice tight and controlled, relaying information fast. A family inside Cedar Ridge was stranded in a vehicle that had slid off the road near one of the upper loops. The parents were fine, shaken but unhurt. The infant in the back seat was not doing well. Exposure was becoming a concern. No plows had reached them. No tow truck could make it past the gate. Emergency crews were blocked at the entrance, staring at frozen steel and drifting snow. The gate was frozen shut. I stood there listening, phone pressed hard to my ear, every muscle in my body screaming to move. I knew those roads. I knew the grades, the drifts, the blind curves. I also knew how long it would take my lead truck to punch through if it was allowed to. But I still didn't have clearance. I told the dispatcher the truth, that I had equipment staged nearby, that I could reach them fast, that I was ready the second I had authorization. Then I hung up and stared at the wall, jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Seconds mattered now. At almost the same moment, Elaine called. Her voice was different, focused but sharp with urgency. She told me the county had reviewed everything. The forged contract, the recorded meeting, the locked gate, the weather data, the resident calls. Deputy Emergency Coordinator Mark Ellison had been looped in directly. A retired firefighter, a man who understood exactly what blocked access meant during a storm like this. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He issued an override order. Emergency access to Cedar Ridge was no longer under HOA control. The gate was to be breached if necessary. Any contractor capable of restoring access was authorized to act immediately. Liability shifted. Authority shifted. Responsibility was clear. For the first time since the storm began, I had legal clearance. There was no rush of victory, no relief, no moment of satisfaction. I said one word to Elaine. Received. Then I moved. I called my lead driver and told him to roll. Engines that had been idling for hours roared to life. Radios crackled as crews snapped into motion, the way people do when training takes over and emotion drops away. Routes were reassigned on the fly. Support trucks repositioned. I relayed the gate location and the upper loop coordinates where the stranded vehicle was last seen. As we rolled, the storm hit harder. Snow slammed against windshields, headlights carving tunnels through white chaos. The closer we got to Cedar Ridge, the worse it became. Drifts stacked taller than the hood in places. Wind sculpted ridges across the road that felt solid until the plow blade shattered them. We reached the gate and saw what emergency crews had described. Frozen steel. Drifts piled high enough to bury the keypad. Tire tracks from earlier attempts already erased. The HOA's symbol mounted proudly above it, half obscured by ice. I didn't hesitate. The lead truck lowered its blade and advanced. Metal screamed as the barrier bent, then gave. Snow and debris exploded outward as the truck pushed through, carving a path wide enough for the rest of the convoy to follow. Inside the gates, it was worse than I'd imagined. Roads that should have been marked as fire lanes were unplowed, unmarked, invisible under deep snow. Cars were abandoned at odd angles, half buried. Doors frozen shut. Porch lights flickered in houses that looked sealed off from the world. We split up immediately. One crew headed uphill toward the stranded family. Another cleared the main loop. A third focused on opening a continuous corridor from the gate inward so emergency vehicles could follow. Radio chatter stayed clipped and calm. Location updates, drift depth, visibility reports. No panic, no wasted words. Within minutes, the crew reached the vehicle. The infant was cold but responsive. Wrapped carefully, transferred to a heated cab. The parents climbed in after, shaking, eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. They kept thanking everyone at once, voices breaking. There was no time to linger. As we worked, I caught a glimpse through the community center windows. Marilyn stood inside, staring out at the convoy, face pale, posture stiff. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not angry, not defiant, just stunned. The illusion she'd built, of control, of authority, of being untouchable, was collapsing in real time, pushed aside by steel, snow, and reality. We didn't slow down. We didn't gloat. We kept clearing. Because in that moment, this wasn't about proving anything. It was about restoring access, saving time, and undoing damage that never should have happened. Later, when the storm eased and the roads finally stayed open, people would talk about what went wrong. But right then, there was only one thing that mattered. The roads were open again, and the HOA no longer had the power to stop us. My lead truck hit the gate just after first light, when the sky was that dull gray that makes everything feel heavier than it already is. Steel met packed snow with a sound that cut straight through the wind. The blade pushed, the barrier groaned, and then the gate folded in on itself like it had been waiting for permission to fail. The road opened, not symbolically, not politely. It opened the only way roads ever really do in winter, by force, noise, and motion. Snow exploded outward as the truck advanced, carving a corridor where none had existed hours earlier. The rest of the convoy followed immediately, engines roaring, lights slicing through the whiteout. Inside Cedar Ridge, the damage became obvious all at once. Cars were stranded at odd angles, some abandoned mid-slope when tires lost grip. Driveways had vanished into smooth, deceptive drop-offs. Roads that should have been clearly marked fire lanes were buried and indistinguishable from decorative cul-de-sacs. It was a maze designed for looks, not survival. My crews moved fast. One team pulled a sedan free that had been half buried against a retaining wall. Another cleared a continuous path from the gate inward so emergency vehicles could follow without hesitation. Loaders opened turnarounds that had never been plowed properly because the OA didn't want oogly piles near the entrances. Radios crackled constantly, each update confirming what we already knew. This place had never been prepared for a storm like this. As we worked, I looked up at the community center. Marilyn was standing inside, visible through the tall windows, perfectly framed by warm lights and stillness. She didn't wave. She didn't shout. She just watched. Her arms were at her sides, posture stiff, face drained of color. The authority she'd wrapped around herself for months was unraveling in front of her, not with an argument, but with action. There's something brutal about watching control collapse when it's built entirely on perception. Not long after that, her final move hit inboxes. A mass email to residents blaming unprecedented weather anomalies and external interference. She implied sabotage without naming anyone, claimed the situation had been escalated unfairly, suggested that confusion and misinformation had worsened conditions. Elaine responded before the email even finished circulating. She sent a defamation notice directly to the HOA board and copied the county. Attached to it was the full evidence packet, the forged contract, the metadata, the recording of Marilyn discussing altering records, screenshots of public posts that contradicted internal emails, Photos of the locked gate. Weather data showing the storm had been forecast days in advance. Most damning of all, the signature, the name of a contractor who had been dead for years. Once that packet left Elaine's office, the story stopped belonging to Cedar Ridge. Local reporters picked it up fast. The combination was impossible to ignore. A gated community blocking emergency access during a blizzard, a fake vendor, and forged paperwork. Drone footage showed the gate breach and the unplowed roads. Interviews with residents painted a picture far different from Marilyn's calm updates. Questions started coming in from places the HOA couldn't control. Why was emergency access restricted during a known storm window? Why was a dissolved company listed as an active contractor? Who approved the gate installation, and when? Why did internal messages contradict public statements? Marilyn didn't answer any of them. Her social posts stopped. Emails went unanswered. The HOA page went quiet like someone had pulled the plug. No more updates, no explanations, no reassurance. Silence. Inside Cedar Ridge, my crews kept working. Roads stayed open. Fire lanes were cleared properly for the first time. Emergency vehicles moved in and out without delay. Residents stepped outside, watching with a mix of relief and disbelief as heavy equipment did what it was always meant to do. There was no announcement of victory, no confrontation, no final speech. Marilyn simply vanished from the conversation, and in that silence, the truth settled heavier than the snow ever could. The storm didn't end cleanly. It never does. When the wind finally eased and the snow stopped falling, what it left behind was heavier than the drifts piled along the roads. The damage wasn't just physical. It was administrative, financial, and reputational, and it spread fast. Within days, the county stepped in. An emergency order suspended the Cedar Ridge HOA board and placed the entire subdivision under temporary receivership. The explanation was brief and blunt. When an HOA interferes with emergency access, falsifies contracts, and misrepresents conditions during a declared weather event, it forfeits the privilege of self-governance. Control shifted out of the board's hands and into the county's. Audits began immediately. Every contract Cedar Ridge had signed over the past several years was pulled and reviewed. Landscaping, road maintenance, security, utilities. Anything that involved access, safety, or money. Investigators compared invoices against work performed, approvals against timelines, and signatures against records. The fake snow contract wasn't treated as an isolated incident. It was treated as a warning flare. As my crews continued keeping the roads open, a second wave of consequences surfaced. When the snow began to melt, it exposed problems that had been buried long before winter ever arrived. Water pooled where it shouldn't. Retention basins overflowed. Lawns turned into shallow lakes. Cars sat in standing water up to their wheel wells. The cause didn't take long to trace. Years earlier, the HOA had approved aesthetic improvements to the landscape, regrading slopes, reshaping drainage paths, and reducing visible runoff structures because they were considered unsightly. Practical drainage had been replaced with visual appeal. On paper, it looked beautiful. In reality, it was a liability waiting for the right conditions. Those conditions had arrived. Photos and videos flooded in from residents documenting the flooding. Engineers confirmed what many suspected. The changes violated basic water management principles for the terrain. The OA's own records showed warnings had been raised and dismissed. More documentation, more exposure. By the time the formal hearing was scheduled, the outcome felt inevitable. It took place in a Plain County building. No drama, no cameras inside the room, just a long table, stacks of paper, and people who had finally run out of excuses. Marilyn was there, but she didn't sit at the center anymore. She didn't speak much either. Elaine laid everything out methodically. The forged contract, the metadata, the recorded meeting, the gate installation timing, the public posts, the internal emails, the weather forecasts issued days in advance, the emergency calls blocked by a keypad. The judge didn't interrupt. When it was over, the ruling came quickly. Further investigation authorized. Administrative authority removed. Referral to appropriate agencies for review of potential criminal conduct. Maryland was stripped of any decision-making power related to Cedar Ridge. There was no outburst, no apology, just the quiet scrape of chairs as people stood and filed out. Outside, life resumed in small, careful steps. Residents came out to check their mailboxes. Kids played near snowbanks carved into shapes by plows. Emergency vehicles moved freely again, their tracks cutting clean lines through what had once been impassable roads. People thanked my crew as they passed. Not with speeches, not with applause. Hand waves, a quiet thank you, spoken through a cracked window or over a snow shovel. It felt earned because it was. I didn't stay long after that. My job was never to manage Cedar Ridge. It was to make sure roads stayed open where lives depended on it. Once the county took over and systems were put back where they belonged, I pulled my trucks out and returned to our regular routes. The silence that followed felt different than before. This time, it wasn't denial or avoidance. It was the kind of quiet that comes after accountability finally lands, the kind where false authority disappears and only real responsibility remains. Winter moved on. The snow melted. The evidence stayed. And Cedar Ridge learned something it had forgotten for a long time. Image doesn't save people. Preparation does. When everything finally settled, what stayed with me wasn't the noise of the storm or the sound of steel breaking through that gate. It was how fragile authority really is when it's built on shortcuts instead of responsibility. Cedar Ridge looked powerful on paper. Committees, votes, rules, gates. But none of that mattered once the wind picked up and the temperature dropped. Reality doesn't negotiate with titles. What that storm revealed was simple. You can't manage emergencies with optics. You can't replace competence with control. And you can't fake preparedness when people's safety is on the line. Paperwork tricks work only until the moment they're tested. After that, they collapse under their own weight. I didn't win this by yelling or threatening anyone. I didn't force my way in or try to play hero. I waited. I documented. I let every decision speak for itself. And when the moment came where action was both necessary and lawful, I moved without hesitation. That's not patience for patience's sake. That's discipline. Winter doesn't care who's in charge of a board. It doesn't care who sent which email or who thought they were untouchable. Snow falls the same way on everyone. And when access is blocked, when preparation is ignored, winter exposes it fast. So does the law. In the end, roads reopened. People got home safely. And an illusion of control quietly disappeared, replaced by something far less glamorous, but far more important: accountability. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?